the title of my talk is Growing a Tech Company in Scottsdale. And I didn't choose this topic, actually. Francine did, I think, right?
Yes.
Okay. And the first thing I thought when I saw the topic in the agenda is, oh, shit, Axosoft is barely a 30-person company. We're not really qualified, or I'm not really qualified to talk about this. So within a stone's throw of my office in Scottsdale is GoDaddy. So I called up Bob Parsons to see if he'd be willing to talk here, and he was out elephant hunting, so that was out. So I had to improvise. So I changed the title to Growing a Small Tech Company in Scottsdale, and essentially I'm going to be talking about Axosoft and how I started that company and some of the lessons I've learned so far. So, but before I do, the new Steve Jobs book, how many of you guys have read it? Out of curiosity, a few of you, that's very cool. I just finished this book, and it's an absolutely amazing biography. It's written very differently than most biographies would be, because Steve gave all sorts of interviews that were extremely frank and encouraged all of his friends to speak frankly about him as well. He was dying, so he didn't seem to care, and he had zero control over the contents of the book. So the book is not necessarily very favorable of him, but it's an amazing read. I highly recommend it. But one of the things that surprised me about this book is how often Steve said the phrase, "this is shit." And I thought, wow, that's a great phrase. Francine uses this phrase quite frequently, right? and I thought, I actually need to start saying this is shit more often. I'm more of an optimist. When I see something that sucks, I'm much more likely to say, oh, it's got potential, or that's a good start. So I thought that maybe I would incorporate some of that maybe in this talk. I just finished the book, so I'm sorry ahead of time if I say this is shit a few times throughout my talk. Let's go back to Axosoft and talk about the idea. So in 2001, I was working with Microsoft. I was in their consulting group, and Microsoft's consulting group is essentially set up to help their enterprise customers build on Microsoft technologies like Microsoft SQL Server, .NET, Windows Server, etc. And I had this massive project at ASU to implement Blackboard at ASU to go live as one of the largest Blackboard installations with over 40,000 users at ASU using Microsoft's SQL Server technologies, which was very important to Microsoft, obviously. This is in 2001, as well as Dell servers. So you got to imagine, this is 2001 when Google and Facebook and Apple were not yet on the radar for Microsoft. It was essentially Sun Microsystems and Oracle. Those were the two big competitors. And my project, which I was doing, was leading a team of about 12 people or so, was to implement this successfully on Microsoft tools. And it was about an 8-month project, and it went brilliantly smoothly until, of course, 1 week before launch, when everything fell apart. And I mean everything. We tried to test run it with about 10 people simultaneously using Blackboard, just to make sure everything was kosher. And oh my God, nothing was working. And the SQL Server was going nuts with just 10 people. We were trying to figure out how we were going to get 40,000 people on the system over the next week. So it was a genuine disaster. So we spent the next 3 weeks working 80-hour weeks, trying to figure out a way to make this thing work. And eventually we did get it to work, but unfortunately, ASU had to switch over to Oracle and Sun Microsystems to actually get it working. Now, Microsoft had made a $10 million investment in Blackboard. Oh man, you can imagine the stress I was under. I thought for sure I was going to be fired. I went to my boss and I explained the whole situation, and to my surprise, he didn't seem fazed by it. It turns out it's pretty common for projects to bomb. It wasn't common for me for projects to bomb, but it was my sort of first introduction to the project bombing. So it turns out it's fairly common for projects to be 1 or 2 years late when their original project was actually scheduled to be a 6-month project, which is quite interesting if you think about it. Projects often even get canceled. You often hear about $100 million projects, government software projects especially, that get canceled all the time. IBM did a study in the late 90s that showed over 70% of software projects get canceled or run way over budget, over schedule. So it got me thinking, this is so common. I didn't even get sort of reprimanded for having totally bombed. But my problem was essentially the same as everybody else's. I used Microsoft Project, and I would create these beautiful Gantt charts that would help me set out my schedule. I would, identify all the tasks that needed to be done, assign them resource level them, do dependencies, and get a final ship date based out of that information. And then I'd have a meeting with my team, and we'd say go. And then from that point until the next meeting, I'd have no idea who was working on what. And all kinds of things would fall through the cracks. The issues would be unknown. And worst of all, if my team members had an idea of things that I had missed in the original project schedule, they had no way of adding it to the schedule. So until maybe the next meeting, in which case it might mess up the project schedule quite a bit. You don't want to mess this beautiful looking Gantt chart. So it's actually, there's a lot of resistance to putting new things into the schedule that were missed originally. And that's exactly how projects fall through the cracks. So I thought to myself, this is shit. Actually, I didn't think that, because back then I hadn't read Steve Jobs' book yet. I thought, there's probably a better way. So I spent the next 6 months essentially working on a product that would be sort of like a centralized spreadsheet where every member of the team could contribute and track the status of items and add new items, most importantly, add new items that were missed to that same multi-user central database type of tool that everybody would use. So everybody would collaborate around the same tool, everybody would be using the same tool to sort of see their task list, and everybody would be able to update the status, and the project manager would be able to see where things are going. So even if things were going to be late, they'd have a pretty good idea of why or when. And it turned out it worked. I used it on my projects and it worked. It really is amazing that simply tracking things and keeping track of what's going on in your team and who's working on what is all you need to do to ship software on time. So I thought, how cool is that? I'll name my product on time. So that's the first story I wanted to tell you. And the takeaway there is look for things that are broken if you're looking for an idea. As Mark Suster said, one of the most important aspects of starting a company is coming up with a decent idea, and there's tons of decent ideas out there. The first time you think the phrase, this is shit, that's probably a pretty good indication that, hey, there's something to be improved there. So now I was a micro ISV of one, and I had absolutely no money. And I thought, how am I going to market this product that is basically a V1 tool? It's fairly rudimentary. And I decided to give it away for free because I had no way of promoting it. So within a few weeks, I got 700 registered users using the product. And I thought, wow, that was really cool. If I could just get 700 people every few weeks to pay me, then I'd be golden. And so I decided I was going to add more features, listen to the feedback that I received, and start charging for version 2, which I did. And revenues started pouring in. My first month's revenue, yes, my first month's revenues were an impressive $149. I had one sale, it was an international sale, and I was like, yes! And the second month revenue was $298, and I was like, woo-hoo! That's double the first month's revenue, month to month, 100% growth, and if I could just keep this up for the next 24 months, I'd be bigger than Microsoft. Seriously, do the math, I'd be bigger than Microsoft. If all I needed to do is get 100% month-over-month growth, bigger than Microsoft. That was totally encouraging. I was absolutely pumped. Not really, I was thinking, this is shit. I worked about a year on this project, and all I got was about $300 in revenue. It sucked. So I continued to give away my product mostly for free. I charged companies that had more than 10 team members or whatever. But for the most part, people use the product for free, up to teams of 10. So I got this fairly decent following, and over time, real revenues did actually start coming in, maybe after a year and a half, close to 2 years. And I had no idea what to do with all that money that was coming in, so I decided, hey, hiring and advertising are things that I've read about in business books, so that might be a good way to spend the money. So that's what I did, and finally, I had a real company. So the takeaway there is that a good marketing plan is to give away things for free. This is what we now call the freemium model, but actually maybe just giving it away for free when it still sucks and it's at the early stages might be a great way to get something started, especially if you're doing it on the side. So you can help build the following before you actually start charging for it. So now I have a real company, and I learned a few lessons, a few of which I'd like to share with you. The first is hiring. We all know we should hire great people, geniuses if we can. And one of the statements you hear in the software industry in particular is that really superstars, A+ team players, could be as much as 20 times more productive than good players, right? How many of you guys have heard that statement? Lots. Okay, lots of hands going up. And I feel like that doesn't fully tell the entire story. It's not the full story, because it sort of implies that if you're going from point A to point B, and the path is well known, that one person could outdo the work of 20 people. And I feel like that's sort of false. If you're writing a bunch of printf statements, then there's no way one person could keep up with how fast 20 people can write printf statements. And for those of you who have no idea what printf statements are, it's a programming term from the C programming language to just write something on the console, right? So it's just an example of something very, very simple. But it turns out that things aren't always that simple. When you're trying to get your product from point A to point B, oftentimes there's obstacles in your way that seem completely insurmountable. You have no idea how to solve certain problems, and maybe it hasn't been done before. Especially if you're leading your industry or wanting to lead your industry, you should expect to encounter a bunch of these types of problems. So in that type of a scenario, actually, then one person alone, right? One person alone can potentially outperform a million good engineers who work in that case, right? So the contributions of one person could outweigh the contribution of a million. Maybe even the million wouldn't have thought of a particular solution to that problem. So you can't really say that it's a 20 to 1. It's not really quantifiable, the values of a superstar, the A+ player essentially on a team. Saying that the ratio is 20 to 1, as is sort of commonly said, would imply that 20 people could actually do the work of that one person, and in some cases they can way outperform that one person, and in some other cases it might not be even possible for them to do, if they spent a million years, it might not be possible for them to do the same thing. So here's a perfect example of that. The Apple engineering team that created the iPhone, the original iPhone, was 35 people. At the same time, the Microsoft Windows mobile team was 700 people. That's an exactly 20 to 1 ratio of people. And Microsoft had a much longer head start over Apple. Apple started iPhone development in 2005. Microsoft had Windows Mobile going all the way from the late 90s. And yet the Apple team engineered both the software and the hardware versus Microsoft just doing the software, was able to outdo them in just enormous ways that was unthinkable to the Windows Mobile team. So not only unthinkable to the Windows Mobile team, to the entire world, because nobody else in the phone industry was doing anything even remotely close to that. So when hiring, the takeaway here is hire as many geniuses as you can find, because one of the great things about the genius is not the 20 to 1 ratio, but it's they don't necessarily cost that much more. They might cost double or close to that. In most cases, they don't even cost double to your business, but it's worth sort of hanging out and waiting for that level of quality of people. So that's one of the lessons learned, and I feel like maybe I made some compromises earlier on that we no longer do at Axosoft, and it was an important lesson. So another important lesson is saying no. Saying no and saying no often is actually a very key indicator or a key success factor. As soon as I had real revenues and a company going, customers would come to me and ask for custom features. And generally speaking, it wasn't too hard to say no to custom features. I'd take note of what they wanted. But in some cases, companies were willing to offer me money to customize my product for them, as much as $50,000. Now, when you're making about $10,000 a month in revenue, and you can all of a sudden do a custom feature for a customer, maybe spend the next 3 months working on something and get $50,000 influx of revenue into your company, that's a very, very hard thing to say no to. But I did some thinking, and I thought, do I want to give up working the next 3 months on 3 or 4 different features that a whole bunch of people would want, or would I want to work on one feature or one set of features that one customer wants, and that might complicate my product for everybody else and provides no value to everybody else. And I decided I need to make a declaration to myself that I will never work, I will never do custom features for money. And if I make that declaration, then I can choose which features I work on. And I'll do it for free. If a customer asks for something, I would often tell them, you know what, I'm willing to pay for it. I'd say, I don't want your money. It's a great idea. I will incorporate it into the product on my time, on my schedule, on my terms, and you're going to have it, I wouldn't say all of that stuff, but you're going to have it for free the next time that the product has been updated. So that in itself is a very hard thing to do. It's also very hard not to get distracted with all these other side ideas that you have as an entrepreneur. So you have to say no often. So the takeaway there is, make sure you say no frequently. And then finally, the last story that I have is starts out about office space. In 2008, we had outgrown our office space, and we were looking at a much larger office space, more than doubling the square footage that we were trying to get. And we were in final stages of talks for the office space that we were looking at. And we had the whole thing designed, and we had it designed with cube farms. It looked brilliant, and we were getting a smoking deal at $30 a square foot, which in today's market is laughable, but back then, trust me, it was a smoking deal. And we were about to sign the paperwork. Literally, the week we were supposed to sign the paperwork, it was in September. And something very interesting happened. The economy collapsed, which was very fortunate timing for us, because had it collapsed 1 week later, we would have been in this 5-year contract at $30 a square foot for a fairly large office space. Now, we did okay out of the economic downturn, and a year later, we were looking at office space again. We put it obviously on hold, and a year later, we were looking at office space again. And this time, we were like, wait a second, the market has collapsed, and maybe we should consider buying versus renting. So we decided to buy, but that's not the interesting part of the story. The interesting part of the story happened when we went to design the space that we had just bought, because we thought originally that we would simply take what we had already designed in the previous space and bring it over to the new space that we had just bought, and we'd be golden. But then we thought, wait a second, the previous space, we designed it with sort of the intent of what the landlord would want, which is making sure that the place was going to be rentable the next time around after we moved out. But we don't have that problem, because this time we're the landlord. So we wrote down our goals. What's our goals for the new office space? And we had 3 primary goals. The first was that the office space would have to provide an easy way for people to be able to collaborate. It had to provide a low noise environment and provide screen privacy. Originally we had privacy, but then we realized the main thing privacy means is that people want to be able to, or I want to be able to update my Facebook status in peace, right? So screen privacy is what's really important. You want to be able to check your bank account and, whatever, and you're going to sometimes need to do it at work. So these 3 sort of goals for office space are actually somewhat contradictory, because if you have an open environment like this, that's great. In some cases, many companies actually now go with this total open environment. It works great for collaboration, and it nails the sort of collaboration bullet point. But then you have a very noisy environment, especially if people are on their phones and so on. So it sort of misses on the noise aspect, and it has 0 privacy, so it misses on the privacy aspect. If you go with all individual offices, which again has been somewhat popularized by some companies, then you sort of nail the noise and privacy issue, but then you have 0 collaboration, which totally blows. If anything is super important on this list, you may as well have it be collaboration rather than the noise and privacy issues, because you're going to have one of the 3. That's the most important one. And then if you go with a cube farm, you actually miss out on all 3 of these things. So, because you have 0 collaboration in a cube farm, you have no noise, and as anybody who's been in a cube farm will attest to, you can hear the conversations, the phone conversations of 5 cubes over, and you have no screen privacy, because you're staring into your cube, and the person standing behind you can see exactly what you're doing, or walker-wise can see exactly what you're doing. And so There is no privacy in cube farms. So you miss out on all three of these things. And then it hit us that productive teams are fairly small. In fact, there's some study done that teams greater than the size of 7, the number 7, is sort of becoming counterproductive. So we thought our teams are going to be fairly small as the company grows. What if we solve this problem on a team-by-team basis? So we did some sketches on our whiteboard, and we came up with the concept of team rooms that we hadn't heard before up to this point. And we sketched out something like this, where the desks would be in the middle, everybody would be facing in, walls would be behind them, and the entrance point of the room would be in the center so that nobody had sort of any, it would address all the privacy issues and so on. So this is what it ended up looking like. As you can see, 6 people in a room facing their screens. You can't see anybody's screen. The camera is exactly where the door is, so the passerbys cannot see what's going on the person's screen, and everybody has access to a whiteboard behind them, and they can easily collaborate within a team room. So this actually turned out to work amazingly well. I mean, like, our productivity literally jumped once we went from the cube farms to this new office. For over a year and a half, we've been working in this environment, and it's been absolutely awesome. It's worked out really good. And so many other companies have been inspired by it that we now give regular tours of our office space with companies who want to emulate something like it. So it's been very cool. Now, the takeaway there is to think like an owner, right? What's interesting is that not that the other landlord wouldn't have allowed us to do this, it's just that our mentality when we were renting office space was that of a renter, a passerby. We wanted to make sure that it was going to address the needs of the next group that was going to be in there. Screw that, you got to think like an owner. If we had asked the landlord, maybe the landlord would have been just fine giving us the opportunity to make those team rooms. But we didn't, because we weren't thinking like the owner of that space, even though we were going to pay for it for the next 5 years. So another thing that this totally applies to, this sort of same type of mentality, is the whole exit strategy mentality, right? Especially if you're looking for investment, the exit strategy is extremely important to the investor who's going to invest in you. But it shouldn't be the most important thing to you, right? It's sort of like the renter. We were worried about the landlord. As an entrepreneur, you shouldn't be worried about the investors exiting the company. You should be worried about building a company that you would want to own versus a company that's going to be sold off to someone else. Because if you want to own it, you're going to make very different decisions than what you're going to do if you're just a renter of that company. So don't think about your exit strategy as your number one priority, as many seem to sort of indicate that's the way it should go. And that's my talk. That's it. Appreciate it.